Hey everyone, it's Garrick with Eco-Stylist, and today I'm going to talk about a popular question we get, which is how do we rate brands for ethics and sustainability, right? This is a big question in the sustainable fashion space, and obviously you can learn about this on our website. We have a page where we talk about how we rate the brands. You can also look at our blog articles, like our brands to avoid, for example, with the fast fashion brands, where we'll use our criteria to analyze the brands and show you, where they excel and where they need improvement, and break it down like that. So there's obviously ways you can learn about our criteria, but here I'm going to go even deeper. I'm going to go deeper in this video than any of those resources do, and I'm really going to show you like everything we look for in a brand. So just to give you a quick kind of like high level of what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to talk about like why this matters, right? Like why do we have an in-depth criteria that we use to evaluate these brands? So why does this matter? Then we're going to get into how we rate. So I'm going to give you a high level overview of how we rate these brands. And then if you're excited to go deeper than that, I'm going to go deeper. So then after that, we'll have a deep dive into the criteria and how we rate. And then we're going to talk about things like, have we always had the same criteria? So we've been around for over 5 years, and some questions are like, have our ratings changed over those 5 years? And of course they have, and I'll talk about that. And then finally, because if we've been lucky enough to have you following us for all that time, you've probably noticed that yourself, but I'm sure most of our viewers haven't probably noticed those kind of changes. Anyway, and then finally I'll talk about like how often we update brand ratings and things like that. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Okay, so let's kick it off with why does this matter, right? So why do we evaluate brands for sustainability? Well, the reason we do this, and it obviously makes us different from things like blogs, it makes us different from just like sustainable fashion blogs or, like, Newsweek or like USA Today having like top 10 sustainable brands, right? It makes us very different from them because they, especially sources like that, like the media sources, they're not using any kind of criteria to evaluate those brands. So they're giving you 10 recommendations based on like what they think is a sustainable brand, but not based on any set criteria. And I think you, without me probably explaining, you already see why that's a problem. Because then that really depends more on like the way the brand is perceived than how sustainable the brand is. So it's really important to have criteria because it makes it more scientific, right? It's like, instead of just saying like, oh, I feel this brand is sustainable or like I trust my gut or whatever, right? It's like, no, it's like we use the same principles every time to evaluate every brand. And that's how we create a resource for you that you can use and trust, right? So that's why we do it. It's also some other big reasons are like greenwashing, right? There's a lot of greenwashing in the sustainable fashion space. There's a lot of fast fashion trying to be sustainable, and I'll get into like how we address fast fashion in our criteria further down. But basically, yeah, so these are all some reasons you can see of why it's really important that we do this. Okay, so let's get into how we rate brands. Now, first, I'm going to talk about how we rate brands at a high level. So in this section, I'm just going to give you an overview of everything we look at, but I'm not going to go too deep into any of it. That's what I'll do in the next section. Next section, we'll go deep into all of this. So first off, how we rate them is we rate them on 3 pillars, okay? These 3 pillars make up the majority of the points that a brand can earn. And so these are transparency, fair labor, and sustainably made. Now, after that, we also have 2 other sections, which one makes up a smaller amount of points, and that's DEI. And then finally, we have a section where we can give brands negative points, and these are our 3 principles. And you can think of our 3 pillars and the DEI section as like the quantitative part. We have all these questions and brands get points. And you can think of our principles as like the qualitative part of our brand research. These are things that we check for to ensure that not only are these brands, employing ethical and sustainable practices, but we do this to ensure that they're actually brands that meet the highest standards, right? We want to recommend brands to you that are the leaders in the sustainable fashion space, and our principles help us to check for that, right? It helps make sure that every brand we recommend to you isn't just passing like our quantitative stats, they're also brands that we would spend our money on, brands that we feel great supporting, and our principles help keep that in check, okay? So that's the basics of it. And then really quick here in the high level section, I'll talk a little more about the pillars because I know they're pretty important to kind of think about it more in a little more detail. So first with transparency, like what are we looking for there? We're looking for how transparent their supply chain is, right? Does the brand share like who made the clothes, where the factories are that sewed them, as well as the rest of their supply chain, right? A fashion supply chain isn't just about sewing. It's also like, where was let's say it's cotton, right? It's like, where was the cotton grown? And then, where was the cotton, turned into fabric, and where was the fabric dyed, and then maybe the fabric was sent to the factory to be sewn, right? So there's these different steps in the supply chain. And we look for transparency throughout all of it. Fair labor is all about, what it sounds like, right? It's all about wages and benefits for clothing makers, right? So clothing makers, there's over 70 million clothing makers in worldwide, and depending on the stats you're looking at, less than 5% or less than 2% earn a living wage. So no matter which one of those you go for, which data point from which source, like it's pretty abysmal, right? Like we should 100% of clothing makers should earn living wages. So that's why the fair labor section is so important. There, we're looking for obviously living wages makes up the bulk of that. It's like, does the brand offer evidence that these clothing makers earn living wages, and then benefits make up another chunk of that. It's like another chunk of it is like unions. Not just that a brand allows for unions, but that they encourage or provide a feedback mechanism so that they're actually proactive in that process. And that's kind of some of the things we look at there without going too deep. And then for sustainability, we look at everything from CO2 emissions, plans to reduce those emissions, water usage, plans to reduce water usage, waste usage, plans to reduce waste usage, a chemical plan, a plan for safe chemicals, circularity, using sustainable fabrics across more than half their brand. So you get the idea. This one's all about the environment. It's like they have goals focused on the environment, and that's what we look at. So that's it. That at a high level, that's how we rate brands. Now, if you're interested in even more info, then stick around for the deep dive where I'll go into more detail on everything I just said. Like all those sections, I'll go into exactly what we look for. Okay, now we're going to get into the deep dive. So you know how we rate brands at a high level. Let's get into the finer details. Okay, so this is our criteria, and as I mentioned, there's the three main sections, right? There's the transparency, fair labor, the environment, sustainably made / the environment. There's DEI, and then there's our principles, right? So let's get into what this all means, right? So first, let's talk about transparency. So here, we look for things like I told you, like do they share their tier one suppliers? So do they share where the clothes are made and who made them? We're looking here for like a factory list, right? For example, not just like made in China, right? We're looking for a higher level of detail. So obviously, like ideally, a factory list with the name and address, of that factory potentially. And brands. The thing is, brands can share this information in different ways. It's not always the same, but it's really important for us that they share that. If they're vertically integrated, this means like if the brand owns the factory, then they can share the information a little bit differently. This is usually for smaller brands, but it's like if it's just one factory and they own it, then they don't have a factory list, right? They just have the factory, which they share the address of. Other things we look for in transparency is things like, do they share information about what's going on at that factory? So do they share like number of workers, wages, things like that? We also look for if they share information about the rest of their supply chain. So as I mentioned, everything before the factories that sew it, right? So where was the cotton grown? Where was the fabric dyed? Where was the fabric spun? So these are the things we look for there. We're also looking for if they share where they are in their transparency, because most brands are not 100% traceable, transparent. So let's just say, okay, so I'll give you an example. So we look for what we're looking for here is like if a brand says we can trace 80% of our supply chain, we can trace tiers 1 through 3, and we're still working to trace tier 4. That would be an example of what we look for there. Or like we've traced 50% of our supply chain and we're still working on tracing all of tier 3. Okay, and this is actually a big deal because a lot of brands don't know their entire supply chain. It gets complicated because they're buying from the tier 1 factories, and the tier 1 factories are sourcing out to other factories, and so to map it out and know the whole supply chain is really important work for brands to do. We also, in transparency, we also look for things like if they address subcontracting. So the reason this is part of transparency is because what subcontracting is if brands don't manage it, this is what happens. So what happens is like a brand will pay a factory to sew their clothes, and then that factory, without proper policies, could be outsourcing that work even without the brand knowing. And so they might be outsourcing it. And research has been done, and it's been found that when this happens, it's really egregious labor abuses often, right? Like what's happening often is home workers are making the clothes then. So the work is being subcontracted out often to home workers who are working in really hard conditions because they're sewing the clothes out of their house. So they're often like small homes, and they're not being paid. They're being paid even worse because they're not being monitored. So the wages they're getting are often like really low per hour, and things like this. So a really important part of transparency too is for brands to have policies that protect against that or prevent that. Okay. So that's kind of the gist of it. And then I'll keep moving on, kind of in the interest of time here. So let's talk about fair labor. So with fair labor, we look for, like I said, the big point one here is living wages. So does the brand offer evidence of living wages, right, in more than half of their clothing makers? And so you might be wondering what this looks like. Fair trade certified would be an example, like SAA 1000 certification. Um, Otherwise, if the brand shares, because oftentimes what brands do is they only pay the minimum wage, which is almost never a living wage, but brands can anchor against the minimum wage. So let's say a brand doesn't have fair trade certification, but they pay twice the minimum wage in Bangladesh, right? We can then say like, okay, what's twice the minimum wage in this region in Bangladesh, and is that a living wage? So basically, do they give us a data point from which we know their workers earn a living wage or not? Right, that's a big one. Some of the other questions up here above are like, do they share their code of conduct? This is their policies that they would have their suppliers sign and they would enforce with their suppliers. So that's really important for fair labor. Do they audit their factories regularly, right, like on a yearly basis? So these are some of these questions up here that are worth the smaller points, as well as like this one I mentioned on unions and surveys. We're not just looking for if a brand allows unions. A lot of brands do this. They have this paperwork that's like, you know, that says like it's really important that the factories like don't prevent unions, but that's not what we're giving. That's fine, like that's a step in the right direction, but that's not what we're giving points for. We're looking for like, do the factories have unions, or the factories cooperatives, or does the brand not only protect unions, but do they also like give worker surveys so they can give regular feedback on the workers' conditions and if they're being paid enough and all this stuff, and then implement changes based on those surveys. So we're looking for a more proactive measure there. We also look for benefits, which is like, which is what you think, right? It's benefits. Like, do the workers earn benefits like healthcare, transportation, food during work, all of that. And then we also look for if they invest back in the communities where the clothes are made. That's obviously really important because fashion can be really extractive, where countries in the global north are basically just extracting in a way from countries in the global south. And so if instead they're also reinvesting in those communities in the global south where the factories are, then we give them points for that as well. Now let's go to sustainability. So here it's like things I talked about. It's like, do they have sustainability goals? This is kind of the basics. Do they have intersectional environmentalism, which that is an acknowledgement. That is basically like having sustainability goals that account for people as well, right? It's acknowledging that sustainability isn't just the environment. And the reason intersectional environmentalism is so important is because we saw really bad examples of this, right? Where brands were like, oh, we're green, but they're like totally disregarding, the people in the places where the things are made, right? So sustainability, it has to also account for people and the impact on those people, right? Because it's like, for example, like what if a brand was using sustainable materials, but there were like chemicals being dumped like in the global south where the clothes were being made, right? That's what, like, there's an example, right, where it's like, or something like that. And it's like, so environmentalism has to account for the people as well. Then we get into CO2. So if brands measure and share their emissions, and then if they actively reduce those, with real tangible goals and projects. Same with water. Do they measure and share their water footprint? Do they have real initiatives and goals that reduce those? Then we get into like wastewater is kind of like what I was just talking about, where this has been, thanks to like Greenpeace and ZDHC, like this has really been cleaned up, but it's still a problem. But it was a huge problem. River Blue is a great documentary about this. It was a huge problem in the fashion industry where garment factories were just dumping chemicals into rivers, and it was, really polluting. Like in Bangladesh, for example, it was destroying the rivers. And so what this means is like, you have to think about this, like more than 50 million people like lived along this river, right? And when you're dumping chemicals into it, the fish die, and so people were relying on the river for food, for bathing, for laundry. And then when you think about it being totally destroyed with chemicals, all of that becomes impossible or toxic, right, for the people there. So really bad. So not to get on a tangent, but that's what wastewater guidelines. It's like, do they have policies in place to ensure that's not happening? Chemicals, it's like, does the brand have a chemical policy to ensure chemical management? Chemicals are obviously really important both for the workers, so they're not being exposed to harmful chemicals, and for you, so there's not harmful chemicals in the clothes when you buy them, right? Then we get into circularity here. And just to be clear for us, circularity is not using recycled fabrics. It's a step further. It's does the brand think of the end of life of the clothing? Do they have policies in place to take back the clothes, for example, to turn them into new clothes, right? Things like that. So those are the kind of initiatives we're looking for there. And then within that too, we have a repair section here. So if they offer free repairs, for example, basically extending the life, keeping the clothes out of the landfill, all good stuff. Then we look at waste. Are they reducing their waste? Sustainable packaging. Are they using sustainable packaging? So these are all some of the things we look for here as well. And then we get into the fabrics. So with the fabrics, we have two questions. One is, are more than half of their fabrics across the entire brand more sustainable fabrics? More sustainable fabrics being things like organic cotton, hemp, tencel, linen, recycled fabrics as well. That's what we're looking for. And so that's where you really see that we're not evaluating collections. We're evaluating the entire brand. And then the other question with fabrics is like, do they protect the human rights of the raw material source, or of the people of where of the humans sourcing the raw materials? So like the cotton farmers, etc. Then there's a question on animals. This one, it's like if brands are vegan, they get these points. They can also get the points if they have animal welfare policies in place, and if neither of the above, they don't get the points. Then there is the slowing down, right? There's the encouraging less and more ethical consumption. So that's like, that's like if they sell secondhand on their website, for example, right? And ideally promote it as well, like, keep it somewhere where you can see it and find it easily. Things like that, like not chasing after this infinite growth model that we know is so toxic in fashion, fast fashion being the example. Then we have the DEI section, which here we talk about basically the big one is the senior leadership. So is their senior leadership diverse? That's obviously really important. And then we look for evidence of that, as well as like, do they have a diversity policy, which we give them a point for here as well for their employees. And then finally, we get into the principles, right? So our three principles, I'll go more now. I told you what they were, but I'll go more in detail on them, like why we have them. So the three principles are: is the brand fast fashion? Does the brand inspire us? Do we trust the brand? If the brand is fast fashion, they get negative 25 points. So it's a negative point thing. And the reason we do that is because, as you, I'm sure know, fast fashion is the leading cause of unsustainability in the fashion industry, right? Like the fashion industry has become dramatically less sustainable because of fast fashion. It's the rate of consumption is out of this world, right? And it's not getting better, unfortunately, right? Like Zara and H&M started this trend, and then Shein and these new brands are taking it to new heights, where it's like even more production, even less sustainable. And it's not just like how they make the clothes and the fact that they don't pay people fairly. It's also that they encourage a culture of disposability. Like you buy something and you throw it away. You don't keep it. You don't love it. You don't take care of it. And there's evidence, like plenty of research has proven that, right? So, the rate at which we keep garments and everything has been just demolished. Like it's been over the last few decades, right? And that's all driven by fast fashion. So that's one of the reasons we give negative points to fast fashion. The other reason is because if you think about it, we kind of have to, because if we don't give, the thing is, because if a fast fashion brand is doing some of these things, and then we're comparing them to a sustainable fashion brand that's also doing these same things, are those brands equal? That's my question to you. Are they equal just because they're doing some of these things? Which these are all really good things, to be clear. But I think you can probably figure the answer to that question is no, right? Even if a fast fashion brand and a sustainable fashion brand were doing the exact same items on here, they still wouldn't be equal, because the fast fashion brand is still less sustainable because of that promotion of overconsumption, right? It's really big problem in the fashion industry. So that's why we give negative points. Now, these last two questions, these should always be yes, right? So does the brand inspire us? Do we trust the brand? These are questions that should always be yes, because we're trying to promote the best brands to you, the leaders in ethical and sustainable fashion. So that's why we added those. They're each negative 10 points. So if the brand's not meeting one of those, negative 10 points. So to give you some examples, like, does the brand inspire us? That means like, are the initiatives they're doing, do we feel, and again, these are qualitative questions, right? So these are not as quantitative as the ones above. And it's like, does the brand inspire us? What does this mean? This means like, do we believe the brand really cares about sustainability? Are they doing enough, right? Or does it look like they're just kind of like scratching the surface so that you'll believe they're a sustainable brand, right? We want to be promoting the leaders. So we look for like, we want to feel inspired by this brand. And then do we trust the brand? That's like, do we trust the information they're sharing? So a brand could be fast fashion and they could not inspire us, but we could still trust them. And that just means that like we believe the information they share. Even though the brand is falling dramatically short, it's like we trust that they're doing what they say they're doing. If we don't, because the brand has shitty practices and lots of greenwashing, then they would also get no for that. And that does happen, right? A lot of brands, we don't trust them because the information they share is really misleading or often even lying. And in those cases, that's where that comes in. And then, so all of this comes up to basically all of the points lead up to 100. And then if negative points are applied, that deducts from that 100. And you'll get a result here. And basically, brands can either fail. If they score above 50, they're certified. If they score above 60 and above, they're silver. And then the next tier is gold. And the reason we have 3 tiers, certified, silver, and gold, is because, well, first of all, any brand that passes is a leader. So I want to make that clear. Any brand that passes is a brand we believe in, we would buy clothes from. They're the leaders in the space. So any brand that's certified or above is fantastic. We only created tiers because some of our users wanted to be able to sift through, even among the leaders, like who's really shining. And so if you want to know who's doing the absolute most, that's why we have the tiers. It's not to like say this brand's good and this brand's bad. Any brand that's certified silver or gold is excellent, and they're all brands that we love and believe in and are worth supporting. So that's our deep dive into the criteria. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions about it, just let me know in the comments. Okay. So now that we've talked about how we rate brands and we've gone into the deep dive, let's talk about how our criteria has changed over the last 5+ years, right? And it's changed. It's changed a lot. So over 5 years, we've had 4 different criterias. And I'm really excited about our current criteria because it's one that we have anchored ourselves on, right? It's because as you can probably imagine, it's not really sustainable as an organization or business to change your criteria every year because you have to reevaluate every single brand. And there's huge downsides to that, as you can imagine, right? Because that's a lot of time that you could be spending evaluating new brands, right? So it's a huge cost. And so what we've done is we've finally anchored on a criteria that is the highest we've ever had. So version 4 is the highest standards we've ever had. And it's a standards that will be sustainable for years before we have to update it, right? So that's where we are now. But how we got there, okay, so let's go back to version 1. So version 1 back in 2018 when we started was an assessment tool that we created for how to identify ethical and sustainable brands. And it was great, but it wasn't, the standards weren't as high as what we have now, right? We've really we've learned obviously a lot over the last 5 years, and we've really amplified our standards to ensure we're recommending you the best ethical and sustainable brands. So that was version 1. And then version 2 came about when we partnered with Remake. So basically, so version 2 was we adopted Remake's criteria. And we did that because, first of all, we love Remake. We also wanted to collaborate with them because, collaboration obviously helps in sustainable fashion. It's like if you can collaborate instead of like being isolated by like you're doing something over here and they're doing something over there. If instead you can come together, that can obviously really help, bring people together in the fashion space. So we adopted their criteria. It was also because we recognized that it was better than ours. Just being honest, like the standards were higher, and we were like, let's do this. Let's up the bar. So that was version 2. Version 3 was just an updated Remake's criteria. So they updated their criteria. We did it in line with them. That's where we added. That was where the additions of like the DEI came in, as well as the slow fashion point on the criteria. In other words, there's a point on there that talks about like if brands are encouraging less consumption instead of like increasing their production and their emissions every year, right? So that was added in version 3. And then finally, let's get to version 4, which is where we are today. So version 4 came about when Remake updated their criteria from version 3, from the version 3 we were using to a new one. And at that point, we recognized that our goals were a bit different. So we kind of like parted ways with that collaboration and decided to create our own version 4 of the criteria. So what exactly happened there and like what does that mean? Well, first of all, so Remake's new criteria, which you can find on their website, it's a really great criteria. And they have like a brand ratings with it. And kind of the goal of their criteria was to evaluate like the big fashion brands, right? Like these brands, that was really the focus, was these brands that you find in malls. You find the biggest brands online. And it's really a tool for like identifying all the gaps in those brands, which is great for advocacy, right? It's like you want to change those brands. Here's all the things that you need to be doing better. And that's awesome, right? But what we realize is that's not really our goal. Like our goal Eco-Stylist goal as an organization is to help users, like help users like you find the best ethical and sustainable brands. And as you probably know, those are almost never the biggest brands, right? Like almost never. Like the biggest brands are usually doing the worst. It's like you can't, not always, like obviously no generals, but like most of the time. Like most of the time, the biggest brands are the ones doing the worst job. And so they're just not, it just wasn't really in line with our focus, like, right? So we went our own way and we took version 3 and we added the principles to it. That was the biggest change. We added the principles as well as made some other changes to basically raise the bar even more. We wanted to raise the bar even more to say like, okay, the purpose of our criteria is not, it's not like we do evaluate big fashion brands for you and we identify it, right? And obviously we fail tons of big fashion brands and we just never publish those ratings because we don't have time. It's not a focus of our work. The focus of our work is to show you the best brands, right? And so we wanted a tool that really helps to identify and make those brands shine. And that's what our tool does, right? So that's what our tool is for, and that's how we came to version 4. And like I said, with version 4, the biggest change was the addition of our principles, which we talked about before, and all of that. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this journey of our criteria. Most of you probably weren't around, in the beginning, but in case you were, this will explain, how it's evolved over time and why we changed it. Now, if you like this video, please remember to like and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us out. We really appreciate you. And so now I'll talk about the final section, which is how often do we update our brand ratings, right? Now, as a small team, we're not updating the brand ratings like every 6 months, and honestly, sometimes not even every year if we can't, right? But one thing we do is we always share when the brand ratings were last updated on the brand ratings. So you can, if you go to our brand guide and you click on the rating and you scroll down, you'll see when it was last evaluated, right? But one thing we do is we want to make sure that our brand ratings are never more than 2 years old. Because 1 year, like to be honest, brands typically don't change. Obviously, I can tell you this from our evaluations, like they typically don't change very much year over year. But after 2 years, it's like that's enough time where we want to make sure we're identifying the changes they have made. And we don't want those gaps between like an old rating that's no longer valid, right? So that's the standard we've set for ourselves, is making sure none of our ratings are more than 2 years old. And for that reason, we're actually about to refresh all of our ratings that are around that time period. And then obviously we're adding new brands regularly. So those brands might be a couple months old, might be, almost a year old, etc. So that's kind of the cadence that we look for in terms of updating our brand ratings. I really hope you enjoyed this video and this deep dive into how we rate brands for sustainability and ethics. If you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comments. I'd love to answer them for you. I could even make another video if it's relevant, if there's a big enough question that warrants that. So yeah, let me know your thoughts and questions below. And as always, just like you give a damn.